So let's review where we are. We've got our species evolving from a common ancestor of other primates and evolving in East Africa, and we've been tracing the development of a brain that can support a kind of symbolic thought that lets you plan what your tools are going to look like and also have culture in the sense we mean it now. We've traced this from the development of the very first tools, the Oldowan technology, about 2.5 million years ago or even more. We took up the Acheulean industry about the same time as we left Africa, roughly 1.8 million years ago or so, and then went on a rather in rather the same vein for a very long time, for 1 million years or more, with that technology as the sort of core of how we lived our lives. Anatomically modern humans developed also probably in East Africa and spread around the world between 70,000 or so years and 50,000 or so years ago, probably sharing relatively little genetic information with other archaic Homo sapiens like Neanderthals. Even with Neanderthals, we started seeing signs of real culture like Shenandoah and its burials, but it's only with the Upper Paleolithic Revolution and our anatomically modern humans that in the last 40, 30, 20,000 years ago or so, we see the kinds of signs of culture that are really similar to ours, that we could really relate to. Even if we don't know the details, we can see that there is ideology, we can see that there is art. So what was life like for these Epipaleolithic, Mesolithic folks? For all this time, all humans had a lot in common with their earliest ancestors. They gathered food that was available from the land and from the sea. If there wasn't any, they starved, or they moved, or both. They scavenged from animals that were killed by other predators. They lived socially, but they lived in small groups, probably not much more than 20, 30, 50 people, 2, 3 family groups living together. They may have had seasonal meeting places, like the Mesorik video suggests for there, and gathered in larger groups, but much of their lives were spent being mobile, moving around the landscape, which didn't have a carrying capacity that could support a very large number of people. Now we're getting into something really radically different here with part 3 of the course, which we're going to call the Neolithic Revolution. It was our old friend V. Gordon Childe, the archaeologist whose hat at least inspired Indiana Jones, who pointed out the importance of 2 moments in human history that were really revolutionary, and we try not to use that word too often in the field, in a field that considers such a great span of time. Childe defined 2 revolutions, the Neolithic Revolution and the Urban Revolution. And these are going to be the next 2 parts of our class. The Urban Revolution is sometimes called the beginnings of civilization, and we're going to talk about that term, and we're going to talk about the major developments that we get there in the next module, part 4 of the class. Now, obviously, as we consider the Neolithic and the rise of cities and state-level societies in the next 2 sections, 3 and 4, we're going to see what you can probably already suspect, that these are much more complex than single moments. There was not one day that everyone woke up and decided to be Neolithic farmers, and it was not one day that everybody woke up and decided to be urbanists. But the real newness of these developments and the extent to which they happened quickly, at least in the terms of the scale we've been discussing so far in this class, can't really be overstated. The huge changes in human life as a result of both the Neolithic and the switch to state-level societies is something that we'll be following through in the next several classes and next several lectures. And in both cases, although each one took hundreds and thousands of years in their way, hundreds of years or thousands of years, that is to say, to develop. They didn't take hundreds of thousands of years. They didn't take millions of years. And so again, the pace of change is picking up radically as we move forward in the course. And finally, it's another point that I'll come back to, and I don't think we really can overstate. These are revolutions because everything that we have now, every piece of technology, every aspect of how we think our social structures should work, all the way from the Declaration of Independence to the iPhone, all of these come out All of these happen in a really direct way as a result of the changes that we see in the Neolithic and in the rise of cities. The whole world as we know it today is a direct result of these two, as Child referred to them, revolutions. What changed for the people involved in what Child referred to as the Neolithic Revolution was the beginning of what we'll call food production, or colloquially, the beginning of farming. The active management of land and plants and animals in order to produce more food than it naturally would. This is the first time in human history that this has been done. To get you thinking about the way human history has worked out, and I would never test you on the numbers on this sort of imaginary clock, but if you imagine the entire history of humankind to be one day, and the beginning at 12:01 a.m. and ending with the present now at midnight at the end of that day. This is how it would break down in terms of actually the amount of time human beings were entirely, 100%, without any exception, foragers. If the time begins at 12:01 a.m., we get to 3:20 in the afternoon before we even get out of Africa. And we get to 11:30 p.m. Before we get to anatomically modern humans. This is about 120,000 years ago. So we're actually already almost entirely through the day. We've always been foragers. We've always been hunters and gatherers throughout this entire time. And we're only getting to people that are biologically identical to us at half an hour or so before midnight. The first time any human being does anything other than be a forager is just about 3 minutes before midnight. And there we go. Computers are invented 1 second before midnight, if you want to put the whole time scale of human history into one day. This is just to give you a sense for the fact that almost all of human history looked very different than us, with very small groups of foraging peoples moving around the landscape and taking the food that the earth produced naturally. This changed pretty radically about 10 or 12,000 years ago for the very first time. And for other groups, it changed much more recently. In the last few hundred years, there are still communities that are gatherer-hunter groups to a large extent, although because of the changes in the rest of the world, the amount of land available to these groups is small enough that it's very difficult for them to continue to be gatherer-hunters today. But there are a few groups that continue to hunt and gather to a pretty large extent. About 10 or 12,000 years ago, people started manipulating the land around them to produce more food than it naturally would have done. There are several different ways you can get the land to produce more calories, more food, than it would have done if it had just been left alone. Three types of food production that we're going to talk about. Horticulture and agriculture are two types of food production that both have to do with plants, but the difference between them is a difference of scale and the difference of investment. So the folks who would practice horticulture, which is probably one of the first kinds of farming, would have only invested a relatively small amount of energy in the food they were growing as farmers. In many cases, particularly in North and South America when this began, the peoples who lived here would be continue to be largely hunter-gatherers, but they would start farming on a relatively small scale. So the mnemonic device that I like to point out to people if you want to help to remember this is, and here's a picture of a hoe, a relatively straightforward tool. It's just a little piece of metal. You can make them with animal bone. You can make them with wood. You can make them with stone, although they don't work so well on the kind of stone, the chipped stone that we're thinking about from other stone tools. Just a piece of metal or stone or bone and a piece of wood to swing it. A hoe is a pretty straightforward tool. It doesn't take that much investment or energy to create. And the mnemonic device here is that horticulture is small scale, as if you were just using a hoe. Horticulture, hoe, H-O, right? The folks who are practicing horticulture might clear an area of land not much bigger than this room. An area of land maybe
10 meters by 10 meters, 10 meters by 20 meters, a relatively small plot. And they would, by hand, clear the trees out of it or the other underbrush. They would plant some seeds, and they would tend them to a certain degree and get the food they could get out of those crops. They might also move on to a different area after a relatively short space of time. Agriculture is a lot more investment, a lot more intensive, and it also pays off with a lot more dividends after the fact. So an agricultural farmer as opposed to a horticultural farmer is probably only going to be a farmer. Horticulturalists probably also supplemented their food with other things. They fished, they hunted, they gathered wild resources as well. And this planting a small field was like an insurance policy. What if all the deer run away this winter, but I want to double down on having a lot of corn available to me, but I'm still going to go and get all the other things that I can get as well. Agriculturalists probably cleared much bigger areas, and they probably stayed put once they had cleared pretty permanently. Horticulturalists often moved around to a much less extent than foragers, or were sedentary. They stayed in one place. Agriculturalists pretty much always had to be in one place permanently. And the reason is because your very first time you try to be an agriculturalist, it takes a huge amount of energy to clear an amount of land that's much, much bigger. Maybe the size of this building, a few hundred meters square, at least, a few 100 meters in each direction, so a few thousand meters square. Agriculturalists also spent a lot more time and energy creating the resources they needed to farm. These are the things we'll call the means of production. So here's my little image just to sort of point that out. Thinking about this like a medieval farmer, somebody who would spend a lot of money and energy on something like a plow. A plow is a hallmark of agricultural farming. If farmers are using a plow, it's agricultural. I know a plow doesn't seem all that big deal to us, but it actually takes a lot more energy, a lot more time, a lot more investment to build a plow, and then also, of course, to get these animals to pull the plow than it does to just build a hoe and do the farming by hand. But when you have that plow, you can farm a whole lot more land a lot more quickly. And as a result of that, you can actually produce quite a lot more food. You can produce more food than you even need to eat yourself. You can have extra food available to trade. This becomes a pretty big deal when we begin to form state-level society. On a bigger scale, agricultural investment can be really huge. So this is an image from southeastern China, and what they're farming here is rice. And rice likes to grow in a land which has got just a little bit of water sitting on top of it. So it likes to grow in like swampy, deep mud. Well, this is fine. If you're the first person in this river valley who's trying to grow rice, you got these big areas right here where it's right next to the river. It's pretty easy to make it a swampy area. Rice is going to like growing there. But if you're the 15th family that tries to move into this river valley, or the 150th, or the 1000th family that tries to move into this area, you're going to be in big trouble. Rice grows extraordinarily efficiently. If you're in an area where rice can grow, you can get a huge amount of energy out of rice production relatively easily. It's a very efficient crop, but you need to have standing water to let it grow. If you're a person who's run out of all that, you can create more level ground that can have standing water that you can grow rice in. But it takes a huge amount of time and energy to do that. And what we're looking at here are all these terraces, which are basically like walls. Has anyone here ever built a wall? Anyone done any construction work or done any work around your own house? A couple of folks. Easy? No. He is shaking his head. Building a wall is a really difficult thing to do, and I've done it with cinder blocks, right? And cinder blocks are heavy, but you can mix up some quick concrete and stack them on, and you've got a decent wall pretty quickly. If you're building a wall without a lot of those modern tools and modern technology, it is extraordinarily difficult. But once it's built, you've suddenly gone from just this little bit of level ground over here that you can grow rice into all of this area, this whole hillside, it becomes available. Now you only have to do that once, but it's going to take you a long time, years, to build all of these terraces. That's a lot of investment. That's a lot of energy put into that crop, which you need to get dividends out of later on. So you're really stuck. If you're a farmer who's spent years building all of these terraces and growing rice, you are really stuck making that the only thing that you are going to get your food out of. You're no longer going to be gathering and hunting. You are going to be farming exclusively. You can get more food than you would have otherwise, but you also have locked yourself into a particular spot in the ground, which has some pretty important consequences for how humans interact and live. And of course, today, we actually practice something which is called agriculture, but it's really agriculture on an even bigger and scale than this, or than the medieval farming in a plow. We practice something called industrial agriculture, because for the most part, there may be one or two farmers in this room, but I would guess no more than that. For the most part, none of the people here are going to be making the food that we need to survive. We're getting it through a redistributive economy. We'll talk about those too, a particular kind of economy called a cash economy. We're going to be also, the farmers who are out there are going to spend huge amounts of money. I think one of these giant things costs something like $500,000, and they're going to be farming more land than than any of us have ever walked over. They're going to be farming a chunk of land the size of this whole campus, dozens of square kilometers at one time. Just to make sure you can see it, this is the little person inside these things. So a person would stand up to like this. This wheat that they're farming here is probably mostly the height of me here. So this is an enormous machine. This is a huge resource for money, but you can think about it in terms of society. The mining of the minerals, the energy to produce this machine, the engineering, all those people that were doing all those things have to be fed by the amount of food that can be produced by one of these for society in general to make this kind of farming work. So this is horticulture and agriculture, two ways of food production which are based on plants. There is a third way of producing food, which is getting the land to give you more food than it otherwise would have done, which is called pastoralism. And as this little graphic here shows, pastoralism is when instead of farming plants, you're farming animals, or you're farming the majority of the food you're getting out of the landscape is coming out of pastoralism. There are advantages and disadvantages to this kind of practice when you're getting your food from the animals which are eating the plants instead of getting it from the plants directly. One of the advantages is that, as I said, when you clear your land to be a horticulturalist, or definitely when you're an agriculturalist, you're kind of stuck. Once you've cleared your land and planted your crops, you have to stay there. If you wander away, somebody else might come and take what you have put all of your investment into. And also, a lot of your plants and animals need to be managed. This actually makes it harder. The more investment you put in a spot of ground, the harder it is to gather or hunt other resources. But if you're a pastoral farmer, your animals are mobile. You can move. If a group from the next valley over starts threatening you, a stronger group that you don't like, that you aren't getting along, that says we're going to come and take what you've got, well, if you're a farmer, you really can't, you have two choices, right? If you're farming plants, at least, you have two choices, because you can't pick up your plants and move. You can either fight them or you can leave. If you're a pastoralist, though, and when you leave all of the investment you put into your plants. But when you're a pastoralist, you can actually take your crops with you because they're mobile. The downside of that, of course, is that it's possible for someone else to come and take just a little bit of your effort, your cattle. It is unlikely, very difficult for someone to steal all of your fields, but it's possible for someone to come by and steal one cow, two cows. So there are advantages and disadvantages in terms of mobility. Another one of the advantages is something called the secondary products revolution, or the advantages of secondary products. And a secondary product is something you can get out of your crop that beyond just the original crop that you're farming. You can think about this sort of as the gift that keeps on giving. If you are farming wheat, you can harvest your wheat once. One time that plant grows, it produces wheat seeds. Those seeds are the grains that we want to eat. We can cut that stalk down and eat those seeds. That plant is then done. We got to start all over and plant a new one. If you are farming cattle, you can also do this. You can raise that cow, you can kill that cow, and you can eat that cow. And that's a one-time deal. Once you've done it, you can't eat that cow a second time. But before that cow is killed, you could actually get other advantages from that. Some peoples who have farmed these animals have evolved the ability to continue to process lactose. This lactase enzyme persistence allows them to actually take advantage of something which isn't going to run out. When the cow is giving milk, if that milk is being taken from the cow every day, the cow is just going to keep on producing milk. And you can take that milk, and that provides an awful lot of calories for you. You can preserve it as butter or cheese, and you can eat it directly. That food resource is going to be continuous. Another one is labor. We don't think about this directly, but these animals here are animals that you could, if you owned them, you could actually kill them and eat them. That's a one-time use. Or you could take a secondary advantage from them and have them, as this in this image here, pulling a plow. A cow or a bull can pull a plow as well as provide meat. You can have them pull the plow for a while, and then eventually when they're old, you can kill them and eat them. So you've actually gotten advantages from these animals during their lives besides just the meat that you can get out of them. And that's something that's made possible by this use of secondary products. Pastoralists often are actually mobile to some degree, just like gatherer hunters or foragers. And that is actually because of the way the biology works. You actually need a larger area to farm if you're eating a larger amount of meat. Energy is lost as it moves up the trophic chain from sunlight to plants to herbivores to carnivores, something that you've probably touched on in a biology class somewhere. And if you are farming cattle, you actually need a much larger area to get the same number of calories as you would if you were just farming, say, wheat. And so pastoralists, because they are able to move their crop, cattle or goats or sheep or pigs, and because they need a wider range because of that loss of energy as you move up the trophic chain, they actually are generally mobile populations. They move probably less than foragers, but they tend to move around the landscape. Sometimes this is as simple as summer homes and winter homes. People will stay in the valley of a particular area when it's cold in the mountains during the winter, but during the summer when it's warmer in the mountains, they'll move their cattle up into the highlands and take advantage of a second area to get their food from.